At 07:42 a.m., in the sweltering heat of a prison camp on a fictional Pacific island, Sergeant William Bill Harper stood over a pit, grimly checking the edges of a crude wooden fence. The whir of military trucks and distant chatter filled the air, but he couldn't focus on anything but the faces. They watched him, and despite the layers of grime and heat, their eyes burned with something he couldn't place. Curiosity? Fear? He couldn't tell. For the first time in months, he felt their gaze. His heart was pumping with raw tension. No one had said a word since they'd arrived. Just glances. His fellow soldiers spoke in hushed tones, while the women, prisoners, their faces gaunt from starvation, stared in silence, still processing what they'd just witnessed. Strong American soldiers, strong enough to survive what they had, strong enough to stand as men among ghosts. And there they were, caught in a standoff of their own. Harper adjusted his helmet. He was only supposed to guard, but something in him screamed that this moment would change everything. The air at 8 in the morning hung thick with moisture and the promise of another scorching day. Harper stood motionless under the shadow of acacia trees, watching the prison camp truck fade into the distance, its engine's whine swallowed by the jungle. The men, each carrying their own invisible burden, formed a ragged line along the perimeter. Sweat, diesel fuel, and hot metal. These smells defined the morning. Everything about this place felt fundamentally wrong. Behind him came Lieutenant Moore's voice, sharp as broken glass. "Move out, Harper. Let's check the line." Harper's body moved automatically, boots scraping against red dirt. His rifle hung at his side, familiar weight without purpose. There was nothing to guard here, he thought, just ghosts wrapped in tattered cloth. Across the compound, women prisoners stood clustered in a loose semicircle. They were waiting for something. A murmur passed between them like wind through dry grass, carrying tension Harper could almost taste. His mind began to race. This was supposed to be simple, a routine assignment, but those women, the way they stood, the way they watched, they were anticipating something, perhaps something familiar. "Stay focused," Moore muttered from somewhere behind him. Harper tried. He focused on the fence posts, on the guard rotation schedule, on anything but the eyes that tracked his every movement. The compound had been constructed hastily, that much was obvious. Wooden posts held together with whatever materials had been available. Guard towers stood at 3 corners, their platforms sagging under the weight of sandbags and exhausted sentries. The sun climbed higher. Heat rippled off the ground in visible waves. Harper's uniform clung to his back, dark with sweat. His canteen was already half empty, and the day had barely begun. One of the women moved slightly, adjusting her position in the group. Harper's eyes followed the movement involuntarily. She was thin, desperately so, but she held herself with a posture that suggested she had once known better circumstances. Her hair, cropped short, emphasized the angular planes of her face. When their eyes met for a fraction of a second, Harper felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, not pity, but recognition of a fellow survivor. Moore spoke again, closer this time. "They've been here 6 weeks, some longer. Command's still figuring out what to do with them." 6 weeks. Harper wondered what they had endured before arriving here. The war had been brutal to everyone caught in its machinery, grinding down soldier and civilian alike until the distinction seemed meaningless. The division between the two groups felt heavier than the tropical humidity pressing down on everything. Harper could read it in the women's expressions. Fear, certainly, but underneath that, profound uncertainty. The American soldiers had endured their own version of hell, months and years of combat, of watching friends die, of surviving experiences that no training could have prepared them for. But now they were the ones being observed, assessed by eyes that had witnessed different cruelties. These women were unlike any prisoners Harper had encountered. There was a hardness to them, a coldness born from necessity, and their silence carried weight like iron. In the recesses of his mind, Harper couldn't shake the persistent sensation of being watched. He checked his rifle again, though there was no tactical reason to do so. Each glance from the prisoners felt like a physical touch, uncomfortable and probing. "How long do you think they've been prisoners?" Harper asked Moore, who paused in his inspection to scan the group. "Longer than seems possible," Moore replied, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he'd been asking himself the same question. "Just remember what you're here for. Do your job and don't complicate things." But as Harper's gaze locked onto one woman in particular, the one with sunken cheeks and eyes that burned with both defiance and something else he couldn't name, he questioned whether his job was even something he understood anymore. He thought of his mother in Ohio, of his two younger sisters, and tried to imagine them standing where these women stood. The thought made his stomach clench. The morning dragged on. Harper walked the perimeter 3 times, checking fence integrity, noting weak points in the wire, observing sight lines. Military routine provided structure when nothing else made sense. But the women remained constant, their presence a weight he carried with each circuit of the compound. Around 10 o'clock, water rations were distributed. Harper watched as the prisoners formed an orderly line, each receiving a small tin cup filled from barrels that sat baking in the sun. They drank slowly, making the water last, and he realized they had learned to make everything last. Food, water, hope, all rationed down to the bare minimum required for survival. One of the younger soldiers, Private Chen, approached Harper with obvious discomfort. "Sergeant, this doesn't feel right. They're starving." "I know," Harper said quietly. "Put in a request for increased rations. Route it through Moore." Chen nodded and walked away, but both men knew that requests often disappeared into the administrative machinery of military bureaucracy, emerging weeks or months later as denials or forgotten paperwork. As the men penetrated deeper into the camp's daily operations, Harper found himself haunted by the prisoner's eyes. He adjusted his gear repeatedly, shoulder straps, rifle sling, bootlaces, but the day's true weight wasn't physical. It pressed on his chest, squeezed his lungs, made breathing feel like work. He knew this sensation. Psychological warfare, except the enemy was his own conscience. Without warning, a metallic crash shattered the afternoon's oppressive quiet. An American soldier, Harper didn't recognize him, probably knew, had stumbled over a wooden support post. No real damage, just noise and embarrassment, but the sound cut through the tension like a blade. For one suspended moment, Harper's eyes met those of the woman who had been watching him most intently all morning. She stood frozen, one hand gripping the wire fence, her lips parted slightly. Then she stepped forward, breaking the silence that had held since the American's arrival. You're alive?" Her English was accented but clear, each word chosen carefully. It was a simple question, but in this context it contained universes of meaning. A question, yes, but also recognition and challenge wrapped together. Harper's hand tightened involuntarily on his rifle, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. He understood what she meant. Alive, not just breathing and walking, but intact in the ways that mattered. Survivors of a war that had stripped everything away. How had any of them made it this far? How were they still functioning as human beings rather than hollow shells? A radio crackled nearby, Moore's voice cutting through. Everything's clear on the south perimeter. The words pulled Harper back to the present moment, but the damage was done. His mind had locked onto that gaze, onto those words, and he knew they would stay with him. The woman hadn't moved. She was still watching him, waiting for an answer he didn't know how to give. Harper opened his mouth, closed it again. What could he say? That he wasn't sure he was alive in the way she meant? That some mornings he woke up surprised to find himself still breathing? "Fall back to position," Moore called out, and Harper obeyed, turning away from the fence and the question that hung unanswered in the humid air. But he felt her eyes on his back as he walked, felt the weight of her words settling into his bones. That night, Harper lay in his bunk staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent, hearing those words on repeat. "You're alive?" He still didn't have an answer. Over the following days, tensions in the camp developed like a slow fever. Harper found himself watching the prisoners with new attention, noticing details he'd missed before. They possessed a resilience that went beyond physical endurance, something forged in circumstances he could only imagine. But there was also something unspoken among them, a shared knowledge that excluded the guards completely. Harper questioned his role here with increasing frequency. What was the purpose of guarding women who posed no threat? What were they protecting? What were they preventing? Late one night, Harper heard footsteps outside his barracks, soft, deliberate, careful. He pushed aside the tent flap and caught a glimpse of the same woman from before. This time she didn't look away. She stood perhaps 10 feet from his tent, visible in the moonlight, staring back with the same intensity he'd felt during their first exchange. "I'm not like the others," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "I know what they did to you." The words sent ice down Harper's spine, despite the tropical heat. He didn't understand her meaning, but something in her tone convinced him she was speaking truth. He could have asked for clarification, demanded to know what she meant, but he remained silent. Part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She stood there a moment longer, then faded back into the shadows between buildings. Harper remained at his tent entrance for another 10 minutes, listening to the night sounds, insects, distant voices, the creak of wood settling in the cooling air. When he finally returned to his bunk, sleep refused to come. The next morning, everything looked the same guard rotations, the same distribution of rations, the same oppressive heat. But Harper moved through it all with new awareness, watching the woman when he thought she wasn't looking, wondering what she had meant. Moore noticed his distraction. "Problem, Sergeant?" "No, sir. Just tired." "Aren't we all?" Moore lit a cigarette, squinting against the smoke. "Word from command is we're holding position here another month minimum, maybe longer. They're still deciding what to do with the prisoners." Another month. Harper absorbed this information, uncertain whether it was good or bad news. Another month of questions without answers, of watching and being watched, of feeling like he was missing some crucial piece of information that would make everything make sense. A few days later, routine shattered. A radio call crackled through at dawn. A prisoner had escaped during the night, and Harper's team was called to secure the perimeter and conduct a search. It was a distraction, Harper realized, a chance to focus on something concrete rather than the persistent psychological weight of guard duty. But as the operation unfolded, complications emerged. The escaped prisoner had headed into the dense jungle that surrounded the camp on 3 sides. Harper's squad moved through vegetation that fought back, vines catching at equipment, insects swarming around exposed skin. The heat was somehow worse under the canopy, trapped and thick. They found the escaped prisoner 3 hours later, collapsed near a stream, too weak from malnutrition to have made it more than a mile from the compound. It was a man, elderly, delirious with fever. Harper and 2 others carried him back to camp, where the medical officer examined him with grim efficiency. "Dysentery and malaria," the doctor pronounced. "He won't last a week without proper treatment." "Will he get it?" Harper asked. The doctor's expression answered before his words did. "I'll do what I can with what we have." Harper returned to his post, but the incident had shifted something. He'd seen the desperation that would drive someone to attempt escape in such condition, desperation beyond rational calculation, pure animal instinct to flee regardless of consequence. When he walked past the women's section that evening, the woman who had spoken to him before stood at the fence. "He was trying to reach his daughter," she said quietly. "In the next compound over. They separated families when we arrived." Harper stopped walking. "There's another compound?" 3 miles east. Didn't they tell you?" Her smile was bitter. "Of course not. Why would they tell the guards anything?" Harper wanted to ask more questions, but Moore was watching from the guard tower. He moved on, but the revelation stuck with him. 3 miles east. Families separated. How many other things had command neglected to mention? That night Harper lay awake again, thinking about the old man carried through the jungle, about families separated by arbitrary decisions, about the woman's bitter smile. The war had officially ended months ago, but here in this forgotten corner of the Pacific, it continued in different form. Harper's fascination with the woman, he'd learned her name was Keiko from another guard, grew despite his attempts at professional detachment. In stolen moments, he tried to communicate more, but the language barrier remained a formidable obstacle. Still, there was something in her posture, in the way she carried herself, that spoke of inner strength that captivity couldn't break. As days accumulated into weeks, Harper began to understand that the prisoners were just as trapped in the war's aftermath as he was. They were stuck in a limbo state, waiting for decisions made by distant bureaucrats who had never seen this place, who couldn't understand the reality of human beings slowly starving in the tropical heat while paperwork shuffled across desks thousands of miles away. One afternoon Harper took a risk. He approached the fence during his patrol, making sure Moore was occupied elsewhere. Keiko was there as he'd somehow known she would be. "The old man," Harper said, "the one who tried to escape, he died last night." Keiko's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened on the wire. "His name was Tanaka. He was a teacher before the war, mathematics. He had a granddaughter he'd never met." Harper absorbed this, adding dimension to the fevered man he'd carried through the jungle. A mathematics teacher with a granddaughter, a person with a history, with people who would mourn him. "I'm sorry," Harper said, and meant it. "Sorry doesn't feed us," Keiko replied, but her tone wasn't harsh, just factual. "Sorry doesn't reunite families or send us home. Sorry is what people say when they can't actually help." "You're right," Harper admitted, "but it's all I have to offer." Something shifted in Keiko's expression, not quite a smile, but a recognition of honesty. "Then I accept your sorry for what it's worth." Harper wanted to say more, wanted to promise he'd find a way to help, but he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he just stood there for a moment longer before continuing his patrol. That evening he submitted another request for increased rations, knowing it would probably be denied, but needing to try anyway. Moore signed off on it with a skeptical look, but no comment. By the end of the first month, the daily cycle of survival had become routine for everyone in the camp. Harper observed how the prisoners' survival instincts operated at a level beyond what he'd experienced in combat. They used every moment purposefully, wasted no motion, allowed no distractions. Everything was about enduring, about pushing forward to the next day and the next, with no energy spent on anything that didn't serve that fundamental goal. There was a strange beauty in their resolve, Harper thought. They carried impossible weight in their gazes, their spirits somehow remaining unbroken despite everything designed to break them. They had mastered the art of surviving without hope, or perhaps more accurately, they had learned to sustain themselves on hope so small and carefully rationed that it was invisible to outside observers. Harper began to notice the small acts of community among the prisoners. They shared food even when they barely had enough themselves. They supported the sick and weak. They maintained human dignity through tiny rituals, keeping themselves as clean as limited water allowed, organizing their sparse possessions, singing quietly in the evenings. One evening, Harper heard singing drifting from the women's section, a haunting melody in a language he didn't understand. The sound carried across the compound, and even the most hardened soldiers grew quiet, listening. When it ended, the silence felt heavier than before. What were they singing? Harper asked Keiko the next day. An old song, she said, about home, about remembering who you are when everything tries to make you forget. Harper thought about that, about remembering who you are. He wasn't sure he'd succeeded at that himself. The war had changed him in ways he was still discovering, had carved away. Parts of himself he'd thought were permanent. What remained? What essential core survived when everything else burned away? Do you remember? He asked. Who you are? Keiko looked at him for a long moment. I remember who I was. I'm still deciding who I am now. We all are. The words stayed with Harper long after their conversation ended. Who was he now? Not the farm boy from Ohio who'd enlisted full of naive patriotism, not the terrified soldier who'd survived his first combat. Something else, something still forming, shaped by experiences he hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. As the second month began, tensions in the camp reached a new level. Resources were running low. Food, medical supplies, even basic maintenance materials for the compound itself. Harper felt the pressure building, saw it in the shorter tempers of his fellow soldiers, in the increasing desperation of the prisoners. The mission's objectives seemed less relevant with each passing day. Command sent occasional radio communications requesting status updates, but offered no clear direction about the prisoners' fate. The Americans were holding people in limbo while bureaucracy ground through its processes at a pace that bore no relationship to human urgency. Harper found himself at a crossroads. The prisoners were not his enemies. They never had been. They were civilians caught in circumstances beyond their control, just like he'd been caught in circumstances beyond his. But the war, the situation, the grinding daily reality, it was transforming everyone into something different from what they'd been. He knew it, and yet he couldn't escape the feeling that he was losing himself in this place. The Harper who'd existed before the war felt like someone he'd read about in a book, rather than someone he'd actually been. That version of himself seemed impossibly young and naive, unable to comprehend the complexity of the world that existed beyond his small Ohio town. One night, Moore called a meeting of the senior guards. Command's finally made a decision, he announced, and Harper's heart rate immediately increased. They're moving the prisoners, transport ships arriving in 2 weeks. They'll be taken to a processing center, then eventually repatriated. Relief swept through Harper, followed immediately by anxiety. 2 weeks. After everything, the prisoners would finally leave this place. But where were they going? What conditions would they face? Would repatriation actually happen, Or would they just be moved to a different limbo? "Where's the processing center?" someone asked. Moore's hesitation answered before his words did. "I don't have those details yet." Harper returned to his bunk that night, with new questions crowding his mind. 2 weeks. He should have been relieved, but instead he felt a knot of worry in his stomach. In 2 weeks, these people who had become strangely familiar would disappear, and he'd never know what happened to them, never know if Keiko found her way home, if the families separated into different compounds were ever reunited. The breakthrough came when Harper wasn't expecting it, which, he'd learned, was usually when important things happened. 5 days before the scheduled transport, Keiko approached the fence during his patrol. "There's something you should know," she said without preamble. "About the compound to the east, the one with the families." Harper glanced around, confirming they weren't being observed. "What about it?" "They're not being included in the transport. Command has forgotten about them or decided they're not worth the paperwork. When we leave, they'll still be there." The information hit Harper like a physical blow. "How do you know this?" "I know because we're not forgotten. We matter to someone, somewhere, enough to process our paperwork. But that compound, it was set up as temporary overflow, no official records. As far as the military bureaucracy knows, it doesn't exist." Harper's mind raced. An unofficial compound. People living in limbo within limbo, so thoroughly forgotten that even their eventual liberation had bypassed them. How many were there? Dozens? Hundreds? "I don't know what I can do about it," Harper said slowly. "Neither do I," Keiko replied. "But I thought someone should know, someone who might care." Harper spent the next 3 days wrestling with the information. He couldn't just approach Moore or Command with it. Questions would arise about how he knew about his contact with the prisoners, but he couldn't ignore it either. The thought of families stranded indefinitely in an unofficial compound while the world moved on without them was intolerable. On the 3rd day, Harper made a decision. He approached Moore during a private moment. "Sir, I need to report something. There's intelligence suggesting another prisoner compound approximately 3 miles east of here. Unofficial, possibly unrecorded. If we're evacuating prisoners, we should verify whether this compound exists and ensure those prisoners are included in the transport." Moore studied him carefully. "Where did you get this intelligence?" "I'd rather not say, sir, but I believe it's credible." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Moore nodded. "I'll send a patrol to investigate. If you're right, Harper, you may have saved lives. If you're wrong, we've wasted resources we can't afford to waste." "Understood, sir." The patrol confirmed the compound's existence. 43 prisoners, men, women, and children, living in conditions even worse than the main camp. No medical supplies, minimal food, shelter that was failing in the tropical weather. The patrol leader's report was stark. Without immediate intervention, casualties were inevitable. Command responded with unusual speed, perhaps embarrassed by the oversight. The transport was delayed by 4 days to allow for processing the additional prisoners. Emergency supplies were airlifted in. Medical personnel worked around the clock to stabilize the most critical cases. Harper watched it all unfold with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that the situation was being addressed, anger that it had required chance knowledge from a prisoner to prevent disaster. How many other forgotten compounds existed in the war's aftermath, slowly dying while the world celebrated peace? Keiko found him during his patrol 2 days before the transport. "Thank you," she said simply. "I didn't do anything," Harper replied. "You're the one who told me. You're the one who acted on it. Many wouldn't have." She paused. "Tanaka's granddaughter was in that compound. She's alive because of what you did." The information struck Harper with unexpected force. The mathematics teacher who died trying to reach his daughter had a granddaughter who would now survive. It didn't erase Tanaka's death, didn't make it meaningful or acceptable, but it created a strange sense of connection across tragedy. "What was his granddaughter's name?" Harper asked. "Yuki. She's 7 years old." 7. The same age as Harper's youngest niece. He thought about her, safe in Ohio, never having known hunger or captivity or the death of family members. The randomness of fate seemed overwhelming. Why should one child be safe while another suffered? The final 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Prisoners were processed, documented, prepared for transport. Medical personnel provided final examinations. Supplies were inventoried. The camp that had been their shared prison for months was being dismantled around them. Harper caught glimpses of Keiko in the chaos, but they didn't speak again. There was too much activity, too many eyes watching. He wanted to say something more, to acknowledge what had passed between them, but perhaps silence was more appropriate. Some things existed beyond words. On the last night before transport, Harper stood watch during the quiet hours after midnight. The compound was silent except for the usual jungle sounds, insects, distant animal calls, the whisper of wind through vegetation. Tomorrow the prisoners would board trucks that would take them to the coast, then ships that would carry them away from this place. What happened after that, Harper didn't know. He'd done what he could. The woman appeared from the shadows near his post, Keiko taking one last risk to speak with him. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said quietly, "away from all the chaos." Harper nodded, not trusting his voice immediately. "You asked me once if I remembered who I was," Keiko continued. "I've been thinking about that question. I think the answer is that we're not who we were, but we're also not just what the war made us. We're something new, still forming." "I think you're right," Harper said. "I don't know who I am anymore, but I'm starting to think that's okay. Maybe we're all still becoming." "Maybe," Keiko agreed. She pulled something from her pocket, a small piece of paper, folded carefully. "I wrote this for you. My name and an address in Tokyo. Someday, when everything settles, if you want to know that we survived, that we made it home, write to me. Or don't. Either way, I wanted you to have it." Harper took the paper, feeling its weight in his hand. Such a small thing to carry so much possibility. "I will," he said. "I'll write. I want to know about Yuki, about Tanaka's granddaughter. I want to know that this all meant something." Keiko smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "It meant survival. That's enough." She turned to leave, then paused. "You're alive, Sergeant Harper, in all the ways that matter. Remember that." Then she was gone, fading back into the shadows, leaving Harper alone with his thoughts and the small folded paper in his hand. He stood there until his watch ended, thinking about becoming, about survival, about the strange connections forged in impossible circumstances. The transport trucks arrived at dawn. Harper and the other guards watched as prisoners boarded in orderly groups, carrying what few possessions they'd accumulated. The process was efficient, almost clinical, which somehow made it more difficult to witness. These were people, not cargo, but the military moved them with the same systematic approach used for supplies and equipment. Keiko was in the third group. She met Harper's eyes as she walked past, a brief moment of connection, then she was climbing into the truck and settling onto the bench seat. Harper watched until the trucks disappeared down the road, their dust trails hanging in the morning air. The silence that followed was profound. Harper looked back at the camp, already feeling abandoned, already beginning its transformation back to jungle. In a few months, vegetation would reclaim the cleared areas. In a few years, no trace would remain of what had happened here. Moore approached, lighting a cigarette. "Well, that's done. Command says we're pulling out tomorrow, heading to the coast, then ships home." Home. Harper tested the word in his mind. Where was home now? The Ohio farm where he'd grown up? The army base where he'd trained? Somewhere he hadn't discovered yet? He wasn't the person who'd left Ohio, and Ohio probably wasn't the place he remembered. Everything had changed, including him. "Yes, sir," Harper said, because it was the only response that made sense. That night Harper sat in his empty barracks and unfolded the paper Keiko had given him. Her handwriting was precise, each character carefully formed. An address in Tokyo, and below it 3 words in English. "We will survive." Harper refolded the paper and placed it carefully in his breast pocket, over his heart. He would write to that address. He would tell Keiko about his own journey home, about his own continued becoming, and perhaps in some small way that connection would help make sense of everything that had happened. The war was over, but its aftermath continued. They were all still living through it, still becoming whatever they would eventually be. That was enough. It had to be enough. Years later, Harper did write to that address in Tokyo. The letter took weeks to arrive, and weeks more for a response to come back. But it did come back, a letter from Keiko, describing her return home, the slow rebuilding of her life, the challenges of reconciling who she'd been with who she'd become. She wrote about Yuki, Tanaka's granddaughter, who was thriving despite everything. Keiko had found her after returning to Tokyo, had told her about her grandfather's courage, about the mathematics teacher who had loved her enough to risk everything for one chance to see her daughter. Harper wrote back, and then again. A correspondence developed over months and years, 2 survivors exchanging stories of rebuilding lives from fragments, of carrying the war's weight while trying to move forward. They wrote about practical things, jobs, families, daily routines, and about deeper things, nightmares, memories, the persistent question of what it all meant. In one letter, Keiko wrote, "I think about that camp sometimes, about how we were all prisoners there, you as much as us, in different ways. We were all trapped by decisions made far away by people who never saw our faces, but we saw each other. That matters." Harper agreed. It did matter. In a war that had reduced millions to statistics, to numbers in reports, they had seen each other as individuals. They had recognized each other's humanity despite everything designed to obscure it. He kept all of Keiko's letters in a box in his closet. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he would take them out and read them, reminding himself that survival was possible, that meaning could be found even in the worst circumstances, that connection could bridge impossible distances. His family sometimes asked about the letters, about the woman in Tokyo with whom he corresponded. Harper would smile and say she was an old friend from the war, which was true as far as it went. But the full truth was more complex, more profound. She was a witness to a version of himself that no one else had seen, a reminder of who he'd been and who he'd chosen to become.